I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we are going to be looking at Ron Howard's underrated movie Frost Nixon, which is unfortunately, due to time, sort of fallen out of popularity. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I pick a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that I believe has been forgotten to time. We started with the year 2013, and we've been working our way back. Now we're at the year 2008, and essentially how this show is structured. At the top, I give my sort of historical context, where we were at the Oscars. This video in particular is very much a sister episode to last week's episode because of how the Oscars really changed the Best Picture category in particular this year and then into next year. And then in the second part, I talk about more of my thoughts on the movie and what I thought, because most of the time I'm watching these movies for the very first time, and then finally trying to answer that question as to why it's been forgotten. So those are the three parts of the series. So now jumping into the history part, I mentioned that this was a sister episode to last week's episode because last week I talked about how that was the first year where the Oscar category expanded. That for 60 plus years, it was only 5 movies that were nominated for Best Picture. Now there's 10, and the Oscars have sort of changed it and reworked it. And in the past years, it's only been sort of 8 or 9, but now they're going back to the guaranteed 10. And there's always different sort of systems that kind of ultimately change the way the Oscars were run. By increasing it to 10, they also changed the voting process, so it made it very difficult to predict what's going to win for Best Picture. Also, it allowed for more movies to get nominated for Best Picture, therefore sort of diluting it. But in many ways, this was done not because of last week's episode in 2009, but because of what happened here. That it was sort of a long-existing idea. However, this year is very emblematic of what the Oscars, I think, have come to become, but also there's a very direct cause and effect. That in this year, The Dark Knight, maybe the most pop culturally relevant, well-respected movie of the 21st century, was not nominated for Best Picture. I mean, it's sort of one of the most egregious Oscar mistakes looking back on it. You could even say something like Citizen Kane at least was nominated for Best Picture, where The Dark Knight wasn't. And this is a movie that got nominated for 8 other Oscars. It was also the highest grossing movie of the year, and yet it seemingly they went to sort of nominate another Oscar movie. I think probably if I were to pick one that sort of replaced The Dark Knight spot, quote unquote, was The Reader. And because of this, there was a backlash to it, and ratings went down, and there was sort of a concern that the ratings have started been falling year over year. The movies that are getting nominated aren't making a lot of money at the box office, aren't really resonating with audiences. If we broaden it to 10, maybe we can get more blockbusters that were to get nominated. And I think in a large part was because of The Dark Knight in particular. Even at the time, people knew it was an important movie, and not getting nominated was a huge snub. That being said, the sort of process worked. In 2010, we had more big blockbusters like True Grit and Toy Story 3, and we've had other movies like Up. I mean, I think it's no coincidence that a movie like WALL-E didn't get nominated for Best Picture. However, the next 2 years, you had Pixar animated movies get nominated for Best Picture, kind of as a sign to show, yes, these types of movies will start to be nominated. And it worked for a while, I think. However, as we're sort of transitioning throughout the years, for a movie like 2017, there really wasn't a lot of blockbusters in that year, or even something like 2016, I would argue, the year before, that instead of broadening the category, meaning we get more blockbusters, we actually getting more and more maybe independent movies, more and more of the Oscars tastes. And I think that's the kind of divide that the Oscars have always been battling towards. They try to implement things that capture the imagination of popular movies, but the popular movie and the Academy movie are very different in many ways. That before, it would be reasonable to think The Godfather wins Best Picture, highest grossing movie of the year, makes sense. Now, today, Avengers Endgame, the highest grossing movie of all time, wasn't even considered for Best Picture. That's how kind of a divide we have here. And then that's that central debate as to, is the Academy out of touch and they're nominating movies that aren't in line with what the public wants, or is the public sort of going with more spectacle and CGI fare, where the Oscars are continuing to sort of reward these more dramatic adult drama kind of movies that they've always done. There's sort of a divide and a debate as to which is which, but the truth is inevitable that because The Dark Knight wasn't nominated here, They've been trying to nominate a superhero movie until they did with Black Panther. They've been trying to nominate more blockbuster movies. They want to increase their ratings. I mean, this year, nobody even watched them. Nobody even knew the Oscars were happening because of the later date, because of COVID and things like that, but also because if you look at the movies that were nominated, these are very much independent, smaller movies, none of which had a sort of huge blockbuster feeling behind them. Most of were because they were pushed out, but a movie like Tenet, for example, didn't get nominated. And this year is actually a great microcosm, like I said, as to what the Oscar has been struggling to do, which is the balance of ratings and popular movies and actual taste, because ultimately you can't force the Academy to give awards to movies that are well liked by the public. Maybe the 10 awards which caused this allowed more of these blockbusters to get nominated, but at the end of the day, the winners, things like Moonlight, things like Nomadland, things like Spotlight. These are smaller movies that are not sort of these big blockbuster hits. Even the next year, we talked about Hurt Locker was one of the highest grossing Best Picture winners of all time. Even though when a movie like Avatar was nominated. So there's still that divide of taste within the Academy, which is, I think, this year is so important as demonstrating that kind of divide. And furthermore, it's also demonstrated, I think, by the type of movies that did get nominated. The sort of two movies, the Best Picture winner, Slumdog Millionaire, and Curious Case of Benjamin Button, were very much sort of sentimental, more feel-good movies. And then the last three movies were these political, socially charged movies, which have sort of key bullet points in many ways that are often associated with Oscar movies. You know, you have Frost Nixon, which is U.S. politics, and Watergate. You have The Reader, which is about the Holocaust, and you have Milk, which is about gay rights. These sort of key social issues that maybe the Oscars feel are important at the time, but despite that, actually the more sort of sentimental, more blockbustery kind of movies, Slumdog Millionaire and Curious Case of Benjamin Button, I think have been more relevant compared to the other three movies. And ultimately, when deciding which movie to cover on the show, it was between The Reader, Frost Nixon, and Milk. And I was probably, if I'm being honest, The Reader's probably the most forgotten of the three. However, I've already talked about Stephen Daldry on the Extremely Loud episode, so you can go back to there. Milk I thought about doing, but it's almost eerily similar in many ways because of how much relevance biopics have, particularly today. I mean, it seems like every Oscar year there's at least 3 biopics that get nominated for Best Picture, and if you want to win an acting award, almost every single year it's somebody playing a real life person, so that felt almost prescient in many ways. But Frost Nixon gives me the opportunity to really break down Ron Howard's career and his Oscar career, and I thought it, personally as well, it's probably my favorite of those 3 movies. So now into my thoughts. If I were to have a winner, I probably would give it to Curious Case of Benjamin Button. However, I do think that if I gave a solid runner-up, it probably would be Frost Nixon. And I think this is an underrated movie, I think, in the large scheme of Ron Howard's career. But even more so, Ron Howard is the kind of a guy with a mixed kind of perception in many ways, and I think has a skewed perception that for some people, particularly of my age, I kind of see him as an Oscar director. I always think of him, you know, most recently Hillbilly Elegy, but he had that sort of period of Beautiful Mind and Cinderella Man, then here in Frost Nixon, even before that Apollo 13, where he was kind of the Oscar guy. But when looking back on his career and watching a lot of his movies, you know, he started off as a child actor, then he made very much populist blockbuster movies, Splash, Backdraft, things like that. And then one of those populist blockbuster movies in Apollo 13 got nominated for Best Picture, and then he tried to do a little bit more of the Oscar type stuff. But really, when you look at his career, even something like Cinderella Man, which was supposed to be an Oscar type thing, only got a few nominations. So I think I can't liken him to someone like Jonathan Demme, because I think Jonathan Demme is also seen as this Oscar kind of a filmmaker, even though he's made so many other different types of movies and only has a short part of his career where his movies were nominated for Oscars. And I think Ron Howard is in a similar stage where he'll do a big blockbuster, then he'll do sort of a small intimate drama and go back and forth. And even more so within his sort of small intimate dramas, he's really great at understanding the word of drama. And that's what I like so much about Frost Nixon, was that Ron Howard was able to take his sort of Hollywood action sensibilities, blockbuster sensibilities, and infuse it with the drama category. I mean, most of the time the drama genre is akin to boring movies or slow movies or, you know, very subtle performances, things like that. That's what people think of when they think about drama. However, Ron Howard takes the drama word literally, in the sense that he's interested in dramatic tension, in dramatic irony, journey in drama, lots of things happening, and suspension and entertainment and intrigue. I mean, really what the true meaning of the word drama is. And I think he infuses that with so much energy, with so much entertainment, that he's always trying to make you feel engaged in the story. And what it does through his visual language, through the great script by Peter Morgan, he's able to tell this really effective story that is able to stand on its own. And I think what a lot of people have with Oscar movies is that they try to feel too important, more important than they actually are. They're like, we understand this is a big issue and topic, and we're going to have people say these big emotional speeches that reflect social issues of our time. But this movie is very much less so in that. It's more interested in the characters. It's more interested in the dialogue. It's more interested in their interactions. And by doing so, highlights the importance. And I think that's what I like about this movie so much. And the drama element of it, and the sort of political element to it, that it's not the forefront. It's not people making grandiose speeches all of the time to try to explain the importance. It's explained through the character first, and then the political thing, and then sort of the socially relevant thing happens after that. Most of that has to do with sort of Ron Howard's kind of documentary style feel to his camera work, mixed in with some really great blocking and staging and camera movements as well. He's one of those few directors who really understands blocking and holding on a shot, and as well as movement within the frame he's also particularly good at. And the way he approaches this interview, it's not really a conversation. That in many ways it feels like a duel, it feels like a boxing match, it feels like a battle. Each side has their own sort of ring, their own set of advisors. And when we're in those scenes and we have, the back and forth between the two, and then they have to sort of go back, or they cut in the middle, have to, to take a break or whatnot, it really does feel like a boxing match. And Ron Howard is really able, through every sort of sequence in the movie, mine the most amount of tension out of it at every stage. That, it's not just a set of interviews. Before then, we really explain and understand why David Frost decided to do these interviews, why he wants to sort of elevate his status, his role within the team, where he's not really a researcher, but he's getting these funds, and then he's struggling to get these funds, and he has to sort of loan money, and there's a lot of personal risk, but also financial risk to it, and the weight that he's bearing. And then Nixon and his side of how he's really feel chipped by this Watergate scandal, and feels like it doesn't represent his entire presidency, and he wants to get the record straight, and could be his opportunity. And the way sort of these little sort of subtle toying manipulation methods to sort of throw David Frost out. I mean, it really does feel like a battle, and they stress that, and the emphasis when we really do have these scenes between these two guys, it is electric, it is exciting, and that's because Ron Howard's able to mine so much tension, so much dramatic intrigue throughout the other scenes, the pressure that's building, this incredibly tense movie, but because of that pressure. So when we get to those scenes, they feel emotionally rewarding, and they feel emotionally interesting. I'm interested in just a conversation. I think that's what Ron Howard's so great at, is able to do so great, is that he's able to create just a conversation, feel like a boxing match, or feel like a duel, a sparring of the words, because of the external pressures that we have learned, so that when we get to those scenes, they feel of actual consequence. So why was this forgotten? This one's kind of a more odd one to say. Like I mentioned before, I think The Reader probably is the most forgotten of the movies, but I don't think Frost and Nixon is entirely remembered either. I think in one part we often remember auteurs, so people who have great filmographies and have a distinct visual style or writing style. The Wes Andersons, the David Finchers, Curious Case of Benjamin Button could have been a forgotten movie if it was directed by someone like Ron Howard. But because it's directed by David Fincher, we have the top 10 David Fincher movies, and there's a cult behind David Fincher the way there isn't one behind Ron Howard. I've also done a Masters of Controlled Chaos series on the director William Wyler, and I did a full video about him. And I think he's actually very similar to Ron Howard, respected during his day, awarded during his day, and makes a lot of great movies without having a great distinct visual style, but always serves a story. And because of that, William Wyler in many ways was forgotten, even though you look at his filmography and you go, oh, Ben-Hur, Roman Holiday, these classic movies, best years of our lives. I think similarly people look back on Ron Howard in the same way. Oh, Splash, oh, Beautiful Mind, oh, Cinderella Man, Apollo 13, these great movies. So in one hand, it's forgotten because Ron Howard doesn't have a sort of distinct visual style. Oftentimes he's in service of the story. The two leads are were the people who did it on Broadway, and they're well-respected actors in their own right, but they're not necessarily leading man, so it's not like there's necessarily a huge cult around Michael Sheen the same way. If that role was played instead by someone like Robert Downey Jr., would be a different kind of a response. People would be like, oh, I like Robert Downey Jr., maybe I'll watch some of his other movies the same way that they have done for something like Zodiac, or they will do in the future. I'm not sure if the two leads have enough sort of star power to have their own cult, and then the director doesn't really have his own cult because he's very much going from genre to genre without a distinct visual style, always sort of serving the story in that respect. And because of that, it's a movie that, unless you look back at the Oscars, maybe kind of forget about. Or you go, Frost Nixon, I've never really heard of that. Okay, Richard Nixon, sure, but there's plenty of movies about him. You know, it's almost maybe on the outset feels like a historical lesson for a lot of people. But if you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it, because I don't think it's a historical lesson. I do think it's really entertaining and exciting and really mines every element of that drama. In many ways, what I think a drama should be. And drama oftentimes gets sort of a bad rap, but this is not sort of the traditional political, historical kind of social movie, because it treats the characters, as real people that are interested within a dramatic arc, and then therefore that brings up the importance of it, rather than being lectured to, where many of these sort of Oscar bait movies kind of feel like this. Oftentimes they feel like you're being lectured to, or told something that you know is important, and you're sort of sitting down going to a museum. This one feels exciting, this one feels entertaining, and I think is highly worth your time. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Frost Nixon and Ron Howard's career, and who you want me to cover next. Next week's actually awesome Oscars. I was going to maybe skip it because most of the movies are well remembered, but I do want to talk about that year because it's such a great year. No Country for Old Men, There Will Be Blood. I'm going to be talking about Michael Clayton, which is kind of a little bit of an underrated movie, but it does have a good solid fan base, and I'd love to talk about that movie. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.